Welcome to the most far out session you'll certainly find at any sort of psychology conference ever, I think. We're going to stretch your imagination as far as you possibly could with the most amazing people who really thought and who live beyond everybody else, right, in their lifestyle. So what we're going to talk about today is sex and gender. And I just wanted to start this conversation by just putting forward a sort of agreed framework, because I'm a member of the Intellectual Deep Web. Fanny, Adriana, Rachel, and Aydan, the other four guys on this 5 Zoom, are also members of the IDW. And we agreed in a framework that I think could work. Sex is an archetype in the sense that gender is a paradigm. And what this means is that we have been very fixed with sex historically until very recently. So you're either man or woman or some kind of deviation of the two, but basically you're a man or a woman. And that's about it. And then gender on top of that is sort of the performative aspect of what it means to have a certain sex. With different cultures, those expectations can change. Wartime or peacetime, for example, there's certainly very different expectations on the sexes. But in principle, we had sexes. We've also had the people who deviated from the norm. I used to say that of 92% of any human population, we can expect them to be regular Joes and Jills in contemporary American English. So it's just the girl looking for the boy looking for the girl, and it's girl meets boy, and it's teenage romance and all that shit. And that's about 92% of the population. Now, listen, today we're not going to be focused on those 92% of the population because we basically own everything 364 days a week. As anybody who walks in a pride parade knows, this is our day. We're the odd ones now. So please, can the other 92% of you leave the room just for one day? So we're going to concentrate on the other 8%. And I'm really curious to see what Rachel and Aydan, Adriana, and Fanny have to say about these categories. We usually define them as 4% are LGBT and 4% are shamanoid. And the shamanoid and the LGBT, shamanoid in Marston's and Johnston's meaning is the people who can't understand how you can have a sexual orientation or anything like that at all. The beyond man, the beyond woman, and the beyond categories like I could fuck anything that moves, period, the shamanoid people. And they do. And then you have the LGBT who are just like, no, I'm a man, but I like to fuck other men. Or yes, I'm a woman, I like to fuck other women. And or it's just like the T, and there is just like, well, actually, I'm none of the two. I'm actually the twisted, reversed version of that. And then I decide what sexual orientation I may have. LGBT and shamanoid have been with us forever. They've been minorities that have contributed richly to culture. Sometimes they've been discriminated against, like any minority out there. If anybody knows pogroms better than Jews, it's LGBT people. But basically, we could say that we got 4% LGBT, 4% shamanoid, and we're going to concentrate on those today. So what has happened is this. Gender as paradigm changes all the time. Our expectations on the performance of gender, on the sex, change all the time. And that's what we call gender. So we got to stay with the category of gender, like we can play around with the gender as much as we like. And we've always played around with gender. Here's, though, the funny new thing historically. We've started to invent new sexes. I suggest, let's see if Rachel and Aydan here agree with me or if they want to define it differently, but I suggest that the best way to frame that, just to keep everybody open and creative and nobody to be closed down and terrified of people being different from themselves, is to say that we're inventing 2 new genders. We call them trans man and trans woman. So that's basically the setup today. We have men, we have women, we have trans men, we have trans women. And of the men and the women out there, some of them are straight, some are gay, and some of them are in between. And there are also some people out there who don't get any of this at all, and they're all of the things all of the time, constantly. And we call them shamanoids. So basically, that's laying up the framework for the session. And I'd like to start with Fanny. You can define yourself, or you can put any pronoun you want on yourself, whatever, Fanny. I call you La Fanny, whether you like it or not, because that's my tongue, and I decide what I call you. But I leave the floor to Fanny to get started.
Thank you, Alexander. So I'm actually going to go a bit against what you said and actually focus on the maybe 47%, the women and the female archetypes, just because in order to have a fruitful discussion about the 8% later, it feels like there's been very little done looking at what actually are the female archetypes. And I think we need a solid foundation is like, what is man, what is woman, and then to there explore. So that's what I'm going to do a short presentation on now. I've been the past 7 years following Lovisa Alsen's Awakening Feminine Leadership. And the past 3 months, Heather Watts, Adriana Forte, who's also one of the speakers that arrived recently, we have been exploring and trying to define these feminine archetypes, and this presentation will be built off these past 3 months. So I'm gonna present what we got, and then I would love to discuss it with all of you. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so Alexander's talks about the masculine as being split between the chief and logos, the priest and logos, and the chief and pathos. And the feminine is union, mythos. And so unlike the masculine, the feminine isn't split between pathos and logos. Rather, the feminine archetypes all have logos and pathos in them unified, but they're kind of a feminine logos, feminine pathos. And I'll get in deeper what I mean by that, or you see later on what I mean by that. And the feminine archetypes are not in this like dual polarity like the masculine. It's not like you're either chief or priest, and if you're chief, you're the warrior or hunter. Rather, the feminine expression of the archetypes is that she kind of differs depending on where she is in her cycle. So for each phase of her cycle, it's almost like a different expression. So, and that is her period cycle. So like the winter, spring, summer, fall of her period cycle. It's across her life cycle. So like there's somebody not muted.
Somebody who's not muted. Please mute yourself if you're not talking. Thank you.
So the period cycle along her life cycle, so the maiden, mother, maga, crone, and also depending on like what paradigm, so like what cycle the tribe or society is in. And in that like each increment of the cycle, there's a new flavor of how the feminine shows up. So it's a lot more difficult to talk about like these clear archetypes, but we can still kind of talk about like focal points in the cycle. And these focal points, we've defined them as eros, which is the erotic intelligence, this intelligence that the life-creating intelligence, what calls in all of life and leads to creation. The mystic intelligence, which is this feminine intelligence, is this feminine ability to kind of feel into the mycelium, to feel into how everything's interconnected, which can create a inspiring and ethical union, holos. And then the natural intelligence, which is the feminine intelligence of like this natural knowing of like what creates more life, what needs to die, following the cycles, and this truth ultimately leads to destruction. And then the cycle starts again. Another way of saying it is talking about that the feminine stands for the beautiful, the good, and the true. And you can also see how the virtual, potential, and actual that Bard talks about naps in there. So if these are kind of like the feminine essences or like focal points in the cycle, like the logos and the pathos of the masculine, we have eros, mystos, and nomos. What are the archetypes? And these archetypes are quite difficult to understand, both because what I spoke to, the cyclical nature and this unified nature, but also because the true feminine has been so repressed and distorted, like so far back in history. So in the beginning of humankind, we had a very cyclical worldview, just being in nature. How my parents lived was the same as how my kids lived, and how their kids lived looked the same. So it was a very cyclical worldview. Then with the spoken language, as humans started to evolve, our consciousness started to evolve, the idea of the event came into our worldview of development. Suddenly how my kids lived didn't look the same as how I lived, and so on. And in early religions like Zoroastrianism, Taoism, Buddhism, early Judaism, there was an understanding, like there was worship and understanding of both the masculine and the feminine, of both process and event, of understanding that, and how they intertwine, that eros, the eros part of the feminine is what calls in the event. So there was like this symbiotic nature. You understand how the feminine and the masculine never understand each other, but still how they function or like work together in some kind of synergy. And both were worshipped in different ways. But then the more like masculine linear, we became more science, more rationality, and more like event-based, more linear religions like Islam and Christianity took over more and more. And these were very event-based, and they saw nature and therefore the feminine, something that we needed to rise above, that was barbaric, that we need to like rise above, become civilized above. And the erotic became sinful, the most dirty thing. The erotic was what made men barbaric again and decivilized. This feminine mythic knowledge became false because you're supposed to follow the Christian God, not your own mythic sense of what is true, not your own sense of ethics, but like the priest and God sense of ethics. And this female natural intelligence became like the ugly hag, the witch. And I love this from Marion Woodman, Dancing in the Flames. She talks about in early Christianity, there was still this worship of both the masculine and the feminine. And if you look at like really early Christian statues or in churches, you see here how there's the masculine, and then you see like the feminine, that is this like eros, mistos, nomos, feminine, like standing standing in her full power and creation. And then, you know, fast forward a couple hundred years, and here's the next version of the Christian feminine, like this completely depleted virgin mother figure. And I think this picture just perfectly shows what has happened to the feminine in our society. So we have an enormous work of now reclaiming and re-embodying the true feminine. And that's why it makes it so tricky. Like, what are even the archetypes? Because the feminine essences are so distorted and so lost. But this is our what we're thinking right now. And so we have the archetypes of death and life. So this is like the Kali and the seductress, the muse, the creatrix, the archetypes that are the inspiration that call in life. We have the archetypes around ethics and meaning. So like the wise woman, the sage, the teller of stories, the ethical guide, the communicator. And we have the archetypes of law and boundary. So like guarding the tribe, keeping the truth in the tribe, this natural truth, and making sure that these ethics are followed. And so looking at how is this, so back to like the paradigmatics, how is this relevant now? What we really see is that eros, mistos, and nomos, and these feminine archetypes are fundamental to building the network society, what Alexander talks about and what Max Borders talks about in the Grey Robes. And in short, you can say that without these feminine intelligences, without these feminine essences, we won't be able to build something that is beautiful, good, and true. Without the inspiration and the life and death archetypes, we won't be able to build something that is like life affirming or intelligence in form of intelligent life. We won't have creation that brings in both process and event, and we won't be able to there won't be life force, there won't be this fuel in the creations. And without the mystic intelligence and the archetypes of ethic and meaning, we won't have a vision and a direction that is inspirational and that actually means something, that makes people care. And we need membranes and networks that will bring in people with inspiration, attraction, seduction, rather than threat. And this is the idea, you know, the consent of the governed that Max Borders talks about. And we need to create a union that attracts and invites the right people and the resources into our membranes and networks. And that's how we compete among other membranes and networks. And we need the boundaries and truth. We need these archetypes that are like setting the law in service of the entire tribe network membrane, making sure that people are following the ethics. And basically, if we say that the ethic and meaning archetypes are the one attracting the good stuff in, the law and the boundaries are keeping the shit out of our networks and membranes, if we talk about it like that. And then lastly, I also want to go into, okay, so this is what we need the feminine for, but what are then the shadow sides? So Alexander talks about the boy pharaoh and the pillar saint on the masculine side. So what is the shadow side of the feminine looking with these lens? So unlike the masculine that becomes a tyrant if he tries to be both pathos and logos, A woman rather becomes distorted if she's split. So in other words, if she hasn't integrated and is not well-rounded in eros, mistos, and nomos, that's when women become distorted. And if we look at like what women are contributing, or what like feminine politics or societal worldviews are, you could say that it's about change, idealism, and compassion. And the shadow becomes change without eros. If you don't have this erotic intelligence, the change is going to be fear-driven, it's going to be reactionary, and it's going to be manipulative. And change with eros is seductive change, this inspirational change, this change that we're calling in the constructive forces rather than like trying to fix what's broken, but actually an inspirational change and change with libido. And idealism without the mystic intelligence becomes when you don't like the mystical knowledge, like the sage's knowledge, knowing that like they can feel, they have this mycelic intuition, but they know that as soon as they're telling a story about it, it's not true anymore. But if you don't have this mystic knowledge, then you'll go into naive utopianism and perpetual discontent, like always wanting to fix, never being happy. There's always, the men can always be better, and there's always this utopia that we're not there yet, so we just need more feminism and everything will be great. And this virtue signaling of, rather than going for ethics because it's the right thing to do, going for ethics to be perceived as a good person, or the good girl. And what we need is pragmatic idealism. So this deep mystic knowledge of knowing that the idealism is like, it's the map, it's not the territory. Knowing that the myth, the story is something that you've created, and you're creating it to inspire people, but it's not the truth. You know pragmatically that it is a story. But of course you don't tell people that it's a story, because then they wouldn't want to follow you. But it's this deep wisdom that women have lost of holding mistos, and holding then therefore a union. And the last one, compassionate, compassion, my thing is in the way, so I can't see the slide. But anyways, compassion without nomos. And this is this without the nomos, it becomes this victim culture and identity politics, where we're just trying to protect the evil, protect the weak from the evil. When actually real compassion leads to truth. Real compassion is what alleviates suffering. So like when you're telling somebody the truth, you show compassion so they can be with the pain of the truth, not to just take them away from truth and live in this fairy tale land, or to just save all the poor people. It's about a compassion that leads to truth, basically. Yeah, so this is what I wanted to share, just to get like a founding ground for the feminine archetypes, since Alexander has put so much depth in the masculine archetypes, and then from there we can go into the shamanoid.
Hello, this is so good. Are we working together, you and I, this spring here in Stockholm, Fanny? I mean, this is so good, and it fits perfectly. It's like John from Market, I was yesterday at this conference. It's like it maps perfectly, just the lingo is slightly different. But once you realize that behind the words, you're thinking exactly the same way. I'll give you just one little thing in here to add to the model, which I think is brilliant. The compassionate truth is exactly what we in our books write. There's a matriarch that helps you say goodbye when you need to let go and die. The compassionate truth is she will tell you the story you need right there and then.
Yeah.
It's not factual. It's beyond that. Mythos is beyond that. The mythos I'm talking about here, which you call the compassionate truth, that's exactly. And this is also the wonderful female smile you get when you're born, when you're being pulled up by the matriarch, who is, of course, the midwife. It's wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah. So this, it's been so cool working with Heather and Adriana on this. We've been going, our WhatsApp conversations have been crazy back and forth. And I want to say that like the archetypes, they're mainly, I would say maybe like the MAGA archetypes. You know, I was said like the archetypes are different. So I don't really have the crone archetypes in there, but yeah, let's not go into the details.
So I just give you one little more thing, and then we're going to go on to Rachel next. And Adriana's here. Wonderful. We'll talk to Adriana's too as well. But the thing is that, for example, when you talk about Christianity and that it actually was on the right path and then failed because it was Protestant event and then went for the event only. The price we pay today. The price we pay today for a world with event only without the process, exactly the return of ecology. Ecology is thrown back at us because we ignored the process for 2,000 years. And I think the key here is when Christianity stopped splitting church and state, which religion must do, and politics and religion must be separate. And when Christianity tried to be both by taking over Rome, and the dictator of Rome was both the emperor and the pope at the same time, that's exactly when discrimination against women starts. Big time discrimination against women. You lock up the women, you lock them in. They're only marriage material, they're breeding machines. They're no longer women, they're no longer half the kingdom. And this is exactly our critique of Christianity and Islam in our work too. It fits perfectly into this model. So I'm just enthusiastic. So we're going to go on. La Rachel is next. How about your perspective? Present yourself and then go on with your perspective, Rachel.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is an amazing panel to be part of already, which I knew it would be. So, so happy to be here. And now I'm like, I was going to present a little something, but now with Fanny talking, I'm almost like, I'm interested in interacting with that, but maybe I'll just do my thing a little bit first and then we can get into it more. So coming into this, I was thinking, just like Fanny was saying, like there is a lack of like transgender archetypes in society because it's a new thing. It's a new category, like we were talking about. There are some that are faintly emerging, and we can definitely get into that a little bit if we want to. So instead of that, I said to myself, ask not what the straights can do for you, but what you can do for the straights in this conversation, at least starting out. So as a walker between worlds of gender and really not fully belonging to either one necessarily, transgender people like myself have a perspective at the nexus of sex and gender as, for the first time, sexual archetypes might be shifting a little bit as our secondary sexual characteristics especially start to change with the advent of hormone therapy. So what I like to do a lot of the time is try to kind of clear space for gender by trying to do a little housekeeping, excuse me, of my throat, apparently, and clean out the cobwebs of some of the ideas that I find to be overly simplistic and reductive. So one thing that I find in the, 1 second, please. Oh, Lord, allergies. Okay, one thing I find a lot of in the liminal web, especially in the meta-modern community, is kind of a sense that like people have sort of like gone beyond gender. They're like post-gender, they've transcended over gender, and they kind of like contain all of masculinity and femininity within themselves, and they have this like sense of like, I am this complete individual now. I understand both sides. I have all these attributes available to me. And there's like a simplistic idea of what constitutes masculine and feminine in that, right? It's like the usually often it's stereotypical, like masculine, strong, and conquering and achieving, and feminine as like passive and vulnerable and flowing and that kind of thing. So I have a lot of questions about this viewpoint because it assumes that gender is something that we know within ourselves, like as an encapsulated individual, and that we can achieve within ourselves. And so beyond that, I find that the simplistic sort of stereotypes about masculine and feminine really are belied by the experience of a transgender person going through hormone therapy. For me, for instance, like my sense of smell increased, along with all of my senses, really. My sense of bad smells really increased. My sense of disgust went way up. I knew when the garbage was going bad much sooner. And along with that, my sense of like disgust at people's behavior increased. So I went from like this kind of like disdain and aloofness when I dislike someone's behavior to this like, ugh, this is disgusting. You gross me out. Like that kind of thing switched in my brain, which is not something you see in people's like conceptions of like the feminine, right? Being grossed out. Like that's not like a commonly listed attribute. In addition to that, and I want to talk to Fanny and you guys about boundaries, because like my sense of boundaries either clarified or shifted quite a bit, so that it went from this conception, which I was, I guess, mainly handed by society of like, this is your boundary, you hold it like this, and you bump into other people, to more of a dance where the boundaries could be like fluid. They could be inside me, outside me. I would dance around with it to be effective. And then I became much more like amicable, less likely to engage in conflict until I felt like my boundaries and my buttons were pushed too far. And then I would flip to a really much more dark, like unforgiving black hole death mode. And so this is really like Fanny's presentation is making me really curious about, the death and the boundary aspects of these feminine archetypes, especially. I became a lot more anxious, a lot less angry, that kind of thing. So some of this stuff just didn't really seem to fit in with the common sense view of gender. So to kind of continue to press an attack on the idea that we can just contain all of gender within ourselves and know what gender is within ourselves as an individual, I'll take an example from my life. So I'm going toward a coffee shop, walking down the sidewalk. I've been taking hormones for a few years. I've been doing other transition-related things, imaginal work, surgeries, et cetera. And there's a guy coming from the other direction. And he opens the door to the coffee shop for me. He reaches in and grabs it. I smile and I walk inside, right? So this is a paradigmatic event. This is the script that we're running based on our assigned genders at the moment. And obviously this could change based on the culture, based on the people involved. Some women would say like, no, I don't want you to help me. Some guys wouldn't open the door, et cetera. But that's kind of the superficial level. Beneath that, in that event, what's happening is there is like this energy that arises between us. There's like this field that appears between us that's like an energy, for lack of a better term, kind of a resonance field. And in that field, we are identified by gender as our roles. And at that moment, we know our gender by being known by gender relationally. It doesn't happen that like we agree to these roles foundationally. At the core, what's happening is like these roles kind of like choose us. They assign us in the moment. So it's a incredibly relational thing. And I think anyone who has transitioned can feel this energetic shift with people very clearly if they're paying attention, especially hormonal transition. I'd like to hear Aydan's thoughts on this at some point as well, but we've talked about it quite a bit. So, for me to hear like, oh, I know what gender is because I've done this Jungian shadow work and archetypal work, and I've attained all this, and it's all contained within me, right? Like, it just misses the point. Like, if you felt that shift, or if maybe like you're not a trans person and you've sort of like actualized your gender and then noticed that energy happening in the moment much more clearly, that is a very incomplete view of gender to say that we contain it. And so as tribal individuals, as true primates, like I think all of our archetypes need to be thinking, all of our work on archetypes and paradigmatics need to take this into account, that this is something that's very real, that's happening with people, and that there is a gulf, I believe, between genders that really cannot be surmounted fully. And that we need to kind of like it's an important part of society to have this kind of difference between people, not an absolute difference, not a perfect difference like some would fantasize as well, but a difference that is somewhat malleable. And this provides us a chance to actually attain to a greater degree of adulthood within gender. Those of us who do, sort of have a sense of gender, I'm totally, willing to leave space for those who are beyond gender in real senses, or, people who don't fit the typical archetypes and all that kind of thing. But I think that this far from just a constraint, far from just a script that is like holding us back, this is a powerful energy that we can use to develop as people. So that's what I wanted to say.
What a great opening, Rachel. We're going to return to this definitely in the conversation. I would just like to add, for me, working with transitions as a heterosexual man, I've discovered that by just inventing two new categories, I call them trans men and trans women, people are so much more liberated, and they realize that we invented something new. Because I think the elephant in the room is not about this, the people are scared of their own sexuality. I think the elephant in the room is that the trans people today are the first cyborgs. the first proper cyborgs. And we're all going to be cyborgs eventually. Every one of us, 100% of the humanity will be cyborgs eventually. And this is what terrifies people that's not talked about at all, which is why I'm excited about it, because we're actually inventing new sexes, to be honest about it. And this, therefore, instead of just going overboard and saying, I'm totally masculine, totally feminine, everything at the same time, which is kind of a sort of minotaurish kind of fantasy people have, which is rather narcissistic. I've discovered that actually, I don't know what you think, Rachel, Aydan thinks, but I've discovered that people are much more liberated. We say, no, I'm neither man, neither woman. I start with two negations. I'm neither or. And I discovered it by realizing that I thought at first that giving people the hormone they were looking for, going to hormone treatment, was what they really loved. But what I really discovered was that sucking the wrong hormone out was the beginning of the journey. And that's when people started feeling transformed. Like, I get that thing out of me, the negation first, before I can then step into the new hormonal treatment, where my mind and my body finally become one with each other. And I don't know if you felt that. It's just a question I spontaneously want to ask you before we pass on to Adriana, the next one, to give her opening speech here. What do you think? Is that helpful? Because Fanny and I work with women today, and we are basically discovering that women are still forced in our society to live their entire lives according to the male life cycle. This is why we have women going to IV clinics with the 35 and bursting out, completely losing with the 38, because they should probably have given birth to children between 18 and 28, and then be secured by society, going to higher education between 28 and 35, and then after 35, have a careers until they're 100. Which is when all of society would benefit from women having their careers. And it's just, this is where feminism should have gone 30 years ago, but feminism was still too busy trying to copy the male role model, the way I think a lot of trans people still today are busy copying the non-trans, the cis model, instead of really going fully trans, all the way. Do you have a comment on that before we pass on? Yeah.
Yeah. Can I respond to that? That's exactly it for me. And that's interesting about the suppressing testosterone first before adding the estrogen. That wasn't the route that I took, so I can't speak personally from it, but it totally fits with the kind of negation of the negation that trans people represent and embody. So that makes tons of sense to me. Yeah. I mean, it just opens up a lot of space to think about, to not have to force ourselves into being into the dogmas. I mean, I don't want to get too much into it, but trans women are women and all this stuff that's out there. It's like, I don't believe it. And I'm trans, I'm a transsexual, I'm a transgender woman, whatever. Those things, like, we're at the nexus of sex and gender, and we are a new thing. And yes, I'm oriented toward having, if I could have been born this way, I would have been born this way, that's a truth, but orientation is not identity, right? Identity is formed over time in conjunction with other people. So like in the interaction with me and this guy at the coffee shop, that's identity formation occurring, in a specific way.
It's like when Jordan Peterson wrote on Twitter that trans woman is not woman. I just responded and said, yeah, and woman is not trans woman. Shut up. Okay, so Adriana, bringing you back here, especially to maybe female archetypology. What else Adriana's sitting there in Australia being busy with? But the floor is yours. Have your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. It's 3 a.m. for me, so a little bit over 3 a.m. now. So I'm just contextualizing that to say that you're probably not going to get the most coherent presentation mode, but it was great to hear Fanny. I was a little bit late, so I heard Fanny and I heard Rachel just now, so it kind of provoked my thinking. And I'm trying to bring back, so a lot of my work is grounding us back into the female menstrual cycle. So why do I do that? That's not the totality of my thinking, and a lot of times when I speak that, people collapse me as I'm talking about menstruation. So I'm put into a box really, really quickly, which leaves people really disinterested. A lot of the times disinterested in what I'm pointing to, which is really makes it even extra tricky, because what I'm actually pointing to is in alignment with what Bard talks about process and event. So if a male and testosterone is event-like, then the cycle is process. The cycle is a process that contains events within it. So ovulation is an event, menstruation is an event, and you can even fine-tune that throughout. A woman is much more a different person every day than the same person every day. That's much more true. But the thing is, we live in society as if we're the same person every day, which is completely the opposite. It's very counter to the female nature. It's not as counter to the male nature. The thing is, we have, and I love the conversation about Whitehead and process and process philosophy, because the thing is, and relationships, we're always in relationship to each other. So of course, if we were in a vacuum, it's a completely different thing, but we're not in a vacuum. So in relationship to men, women are more process-like. In relationship to a woman, a man is more event-like, but both of us have both. So it's really tricky to have conversations when the dominant paradigm has a certain language and it's really, really coarse-grained in the way it explains the feminine. So so my work with Fanny and Heather is really trying to fine-grain from the perspective of the female psyche, how to look at logos from within, because our logos is different. When Bob talks about logos, I'm like, yeah, I understand. It makes total sense. And I have that, but it's not quite that. So we need to be much more, we need much more of these conversations to be able to put a voice together with male philosophers and male thinkers and trans people to actually really fine-grain the nuance between us, because we're getting completely lost and completely confused. So one of the frames that I use is that a woman is, let's say, diffuse light. So her light, it's more like diffuse light, and male shows up in the world more as laser beam light. So laser beam next to diffuse light is dark. It's actually not dark if you just have diffuse light by itself. So when women are just together, they're like, oh, it's so light, so much clarity. And when you put them together to laser beam light, really quick, really focused, testosterone light, then it's like, now we need to be able to dance together. So for that to happen, the male thinkers and philosophers need to first also understand and be exposed to how we operate in the world. And there's much less literature on that, much less written. We're oral storytellers as women. Of course, humans are, but as women, we're much more oral storytellers than men. So there's much less written philosophy coming from the perspective of women. So it's really hard to have an equal, not equal, but balanced view, because what happens is that at this point in society, and then I'm going to bring this bring back to Rachel, and the power of the shamans, that I see the power of the shamans in this point in society and in culture to help illuminate the confusion. Because when I'm with Rachel doesn't have the conditioning, she doesn't have the distortion of a woman that has grown up diffuse, believing herself to be laser beam. So if you're a diffuse light, but you believe yourself your whole life to be laser beam, you're always going to be less than. There's no other way. You're going to be less eloquent, less whatever it is. And then when you get to the PMS, what is the PMS? We created, it's a cycle of a whole psyche change throughout the month. And then there's this point in the cycle in which she's basically exploding in relationship to reality, in relationship to what's required of her. And then we call that another event. We say that's PMS, as opposed to really being attuned to the process. And by framing these events, we lose track of the process itself. So we focus much more on menstruation, ovulation, not even ovulation, we menstruation and PMS, but we don't know what that actually means in the psyche of a woman. So to add to a lot of, to bring another layer of complexity, when Fanny was talking about the structures of development, for example, the cyclical mind, or the magic structure of development, bringing Gebser in, and that is much more open. A woman can have much more awareness of that in herself when she's bleeding. So in her menstruation, her polarity in her body goes down. It's not like that all the time. So, Taoists understand that our energy flows differently than the male energy. So our understanding of this stuff is so basic in culture that has flatlanded us to an extent that the shamans have come to point us, to kind of make it really visible where we're kind of going wrong. So, for example, when Rachel says, we have been having conversations so long for a year now, so it's but she would point to things that usually women would we would experience in the same way, but we would have a narrative, a justification, to talk Greg's language, that is bad. So for example, I'm bitchy, this is bad. Whereas if you actually feel into what's happening, the bitchy is a name, that what's happening with your energy and how can you relate to reality from that place. Of course, you're always fighting reality, so then you're bitchy. But when Rachel has a different name to things, because she wanted to experience that, and now she's experiencing this freedom from just being in testosterone. She's experiencing the cyclical nature from the contrast of testosterone. So then she's like, I feel more like this and I love it. And I'm like, thank you for saying that this is good, because I forgot that this is just an energy. So constantly throughout the cycle, she reframes things that in my work with women, they feel similar, but they have a different name to it. And when we have a different name and it's a pathological name, then we suppress the energy and we flatland ourselves. So all of a sudden, a lot of the women I work with, they don't have access to this openness of the structures of their mind. They don't have that throughout the cycle. They actually see themselves as a timeline, the linear timeline with blobs of events. So instead of the cycle, you are a cycle. And what Bard talks about, which is also brilliant frame, about when you have these confusions, you keep cycling the event over and over again, like Christ was born over and over again. Well, that happens in a woman's body. Instead of her having events that change her and she can spiral into a much broader cycle and then bring, like a train, like those old trains in which the wheel carries the line of the event with, and it's like this moving together. Instead of that happening, you have a circle that keeps looping in itself that we call neuroticism. And then you have a line that is completely disjointed from the cycle. And we're both here going like, what the fuck? You're more like this. You're more like this. And then we have the shamans in the middle going like, guys, we're just completely confused. So, I'm loving this conversation. To me, is the very beginning of a much more a long conversation to really fine grain what we mean by everything. Yeah. So it's great to be here with you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, everything in between. La Adriana. What a great interest. This is amazing. Again, just short reflection, how I reflect to this immense work, which I'm doing. I'm working with men. The first thing I tell men is that everything we do in here is ultimately delivering to the women. And if women don't give birth to children, we're ruined and done. We're all in service of women. Process is prior to event. Process was prior to event. And then I'm just saying, women have already changed their religion, the switch religion in our culture today. They got tired of Christianity and Islam. They got tired of the event without the process. And that's what they did over the last 50 to 100 years. So that means that, for example, I don't know about Australia. Well, it's certainly in Australia too. I've been there, been in a monastery in Australia too. But as far as Australia, North America, Europe are concerned, we have hundreds and hundreds now of Buddhist and even Hindu monasteries, temples, everything. And it's all about the women. The women have done the work. My message when doing men's work here in Europe is basically the women are ahead of us. We need to get inspired by our sisters because we need now to go into an Eastern spirituality for men, including male yoga academies and everything we're building at the moment. You girls, you sisters are ahead of us, way ahead of us. And then they realize that the event must be complemented with the process. The process must come first. Process and event is what it's all about. The whole unification of East and West is about the unification of the process and the event. And we're also giving the event to people in the East so they can get out of caste systems and other tragedies they get stuck with. So this is a wonderful expression. And Adriana, when you show that process with the event going off, it's just like, have we finally found the merger between Gilles Deleuze and Camille Paglia? And she's sitting in Australia and she's Adriana right now, because that's wonderful. That's wonderful work. So let's go back now to more trust perspective. The word's over to our favorite hipster beer maker in America, Aydan Connor. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I've been speaking with Adriana and with Rachel over the past, it's been over a year because we were already in conversation prior to last year's UTOK conference. And really, I guess where I'm at this point is I feel like in our conversations, we were trying to dive into these nuances about gender, and I started finding myself realizing that I was on my own journey in this process, that there was something about transition itself for myself which had not really completed. And it really, like, on reflecting on what I wanted to talk about today, I was all over the place because there's so much to discuss. The positive and negative about these conversations in culture right now are so extreme. And the tenor of the conversation has become, to be honest, like somewhat frightening when I listen to some thinkers that are relatively popular now. And so for me, the motivation is very personal to participate in these kinds of conversations, because I think that we have some real danger kind of lurking around. There's like a warm fire that we've all gathered around here. We're all comfortable with each other, and we know this is a safe space, but there's definitely dangers lurking in the shadows behind us. For me, the process of transition actually started with my wife suggesting to me that, hey, trans just means outside of. Like, you're just out, you're just, you're not a man, you're just outside of what a woman is. And it was so funny to have this kind of reflected back now and today, hearing Bard talking about the idea of not man, not woman, the idea of genders as being these negations. And that all makes sense to me because we're talking about orientations, really. Like that's what I feel when we're discussing gender. We're talking about orientations with each other and with our lived world experience. And I know that, like, for me, this switch when it comes to the actual physical reality changing through transition and hormone treatments points to something very fundamental or foundational about where are we getting these ideas about gender. And it's about this direction of energy, and that's a theme that's coming up again and again. It's the way that for the cyclical nature, you have these you're kind of tossed and turned in a different kind of way in your life, in your day-to-day experience, month by month, whereas in a pathic kind of pathos logos flipping, I think the directionality is so extreme. You're kind of whipped back and forth. And I know for me that this is kind of one of the dangers, I believe, in the conversation about transition itself right now, is that there's this idea that you find some kind of wholeness through transition. And I would argue that transition is a completely different experience from one direction or to the other. For Rachel, when I'm talking with her, what I realized is she's kind of settling in. She feels more whole. She feels more relaxed about life. She feels more connected and in the now. And I kept on being like, what is wrong with my transition? Why is this so hard? Why am I struggling all the time? Why do I feel so tossed and turned? Why can't I just feel satisfied? Why am I like constantly just like trying to find the next thing and just torn and torn and torn and torn? And that's the truth of it. Is it's the testosterone. Like the testosterone does something to you. It does something to you. I'm not the same person. I was not born this way. And to suggest that we have some kind of idea of gender that's just like, it's just like in us and it's a part of us, and we just kind of like have to like just, I don't know, realize it somehow. It's just crazy. Our gender is something that's changing throughout our lives. And it's something that, when you're a little kid, I just came from my son's soccer game. He's only 4 years old. He's about to turn 5. And they have, both boys and girls on the field at the same time. and you know what? It doesn't mean anything at all at that age. Like, no, gender doesn't mean anything at all at that age. And, you know, so there's this weirdness, I think, that is being created by this narrative that like somehow it's just like intrinsically part of you. And genuinely, like, I think that one of the most important things that I think we need to understand is that we need to find different kinds of justification systems for like how we're living out gender and sexuality generally. Because I think that this idea that like being born this way is an argument is mostly being pushed forward because there's just kind of like a lack of any like better understanding, and there's a lack of a better, let's say, philosophy about what are we actually doing with gender, like why, like what purpose does it serve, what are we trying to do, and like really what I find comes back again and again and again is that these are flavors. These are interacting flavors. And sometimes you can have flavors that go too far in the extremes. And then you add one other element and it's perfect. You don't have to make gender or identity something which is just complete in itself. It's complete by relating. It's complete through relating. It's not a package deal. And I know for me, my gender changes depending on who I'm interacting with, where I am, what I'm doing. And I think that this kind of not quiteness, I was never quite a woman. I'm never going to quite be a man. But through this kind of in-betweenness, there's so much clarity that's revealed about everything that's happening around us. So I'm going to just leave it at that.
Yeah, welcome to Club Testosterone. Like Camille Paglia says to us, she says that, you know, I feel pity for you guys. I feel pity for
It's
it.
terrible.
And this is what I mean with the logos pathos split that maybe women don't understand. We are torn in this split. And my recommendation to men is to go for one of them as if you specialize. When I talk about the priest and the chief archetypes as the fundamental leadership types, also by splitting them into two leaders, we avoid the tyrant. We all go wrong, men and women, when we get the tyrant. He always comes from the masculine side. We can have a matriarch. We can have one matriarch on the feminine side, but on the male side, we have one guy there, that's the tyrant, and that's when everything goes wrong. So splitting the priest and chief makes sense from a leadership perspective historically, but here's the thing, is when I was sitting down with guys and interviewing them, especially talking to trans people who have both experiences, that's exactly what I discovered. Oh, no. Man is stuck between logos and pathos. And then I studied with Chinese people and discovered they're not doing yin and yang any longer. They're splitting the yang into the yang and the yang. It doesn't make any sense to do Taoism unless you can first split the masculine side in two. And then it starts to make sense and the whole movement thing starts occurring there. So this whole thing that women feel whole or trans people feel whole, trans women say they finally feel whole, is exactly what happens. And you just discovered it, that when you do the testosterone, you get all that energy to go out there in the world that have that laser beam thing. Oh dear, it's two brain halves. It's like I said, Ian McGilchrist writes fantastic books, but he only writes books about his own gender. To me, the critique of Ian McGilchrist is, I've never met a woman who identified with any of his books or his ideas. Never. Yeah, they say, yeah, that's the male brain, Ian's own brain. So hopefully he's the logos and somebody else is the pathos, because he's not much of a warrior, let's put it that way. But the logos pathos split makes sense to people who go through testosterone mode experiences. And it's devastating to discover that you are torn apart your entire life and you're looking for that wholeness. And I'm convinced this is why I, as a heterosexual man, want to put my penis inside a vagina. I'm dreaming about a wholeness and I experience it during the fucking. And then when the fucking's over, it's gone. It's hers again. It's not mine any longer. I'm not part of the whole any longer. There's something fundamental to it there that I find incredibly interesting. Let's put it that way. So we don't have to go in a specific, we can be non-linear. I'm trying to be a little anima here, be more process than event. We can be non-linear. But Fanny, do you want to make a comment after these three fantastic presentations that followed yours?
I don't know. I don't have anything right now. I think if somebody else has something like really, really alive, maybe just a small comment on what, just a really small thing, but what you said, like I loved your presentation, Andrea. I loved all of your presentations. And what you said, the train on the track with the wheel, like so fucking perfect. Like, and just a small comment on, you said that like women have found Hinduism and Buddhism. My perception is that it's a lot of it is still stuck just in the cyclical, and they're still not embodying the erotic. There's still, sexuality is still not a part of the spirituality revolution of in many women, or they're split. Like the ones that are doing the sexual are not doing the mystos and the nomos. So like there's yes, women are ahead in that sense. Maybe, I don't know. But just, yeah, I did want to make that comment that like Eros is still deeply missing. And it was also the first thing that was brutally suppressed of women. So just wanted to add that comment. But yeah, that's not really a discussion point. That was just a small comment. But if anybody has anything else more.
Maybe I want to compliment something that you just said, Fanny. We touched on it between the three of us, Heather, you and myself, but that when you talk about women, and I don't know if that's exactly how you say it, but more mortido than libido. That's true. And that's also the diffuse light and laser beam light next to each other perspective. Because of course we are, from the laser beam's perspective, we are more mortido. But if you just have us separate than the laser beam, then we have both, of course, like, because our libido is not the same as a man. And it's not, and even when Fanny talks about seduction, I was just thinking how a man is going to listen to that is different than what it's meant and felt. So I think this is where our language needs to be really fine-tuned, because even, for example, spiritual books that talk about the power of now, for example, I'd say that in some ways, or the presence that Bard talks about, the presence or the wholeness, I'd say that this is it's almost simple from a woman's perspective. Like it's not like you read that book and you're like, okay, but it's not, we don't live from that place daily, because we have been contracted into believing we have to do a spiritual practice in meditating in a particular way to be an event and to do something. Whereas the wholeness of the way we are, like Fanny was saying, is available, but it's not quite available because we're a product of modernity and we get really confused. So then when Rachel reflects and Aydan points to the fact that he's experiencing that turmoil of the masculine, because I noticed that with the men that I work with, this motivation to create this event, this turmoil that births something. Whereas Rachel is like, how she calls it, sinking into the pool of awareness. She's like, I sink into the pool, which is mythos, which is being present to life. So that's, and not having those distinctions gets us really, confused.
I just want to add to that I use libido mortido completely neutral here. And you have to remember that an important one-liner in my work is that libido is nothing but the denial of the mortido. Mortido is always there. So mortido is a positive. It's force for me. It's weird in the sense that when you really think about death drive, it's a drive towards the completion of a life. Like our dream is to one day die with a smile on our face, say, I did everything. I was lucky. I had a whole full life. And in this way, we're talking about people's fantasies. We're talking about the archetypes. We place a woman at the beginning and a woman at the end, because women are much more connected to birth or death than men are. Absolutely much more connected. The whole Florence Nightingale fantasy is all about the woman saying goodbye to you when you die as a soldier. It's always a female face everywhere you look for that. And therefore we can allow to put the phallic gaze, the sort of the fatherly, stern, tough, but tough love sort of look at us is what we fantasize about during our lives, to perform in front of, at least men do. To perform in front of is the phallic gaze. And this explains why I put the sky god up there to look at us, when actually Mother Earth is the foundation. So religion always starts with putting the Mother Earth first, which is the process, and then you put the event, the sky god at the top. So we're doing it in archetypology. And I'm not doing anything that isn't thought through, reflected through guys like you in these conversations, and credited to anybody who comes up with ideas in the process, but especially it's reversed. And what is great in working with gay and lesbian people, or working with trans people, and working men and women together, have these conversations, that if it's reversed and it makes sense, good, then we're on to the truth. That's what philosophical truth is. Philosophical truth is always evidenced by reversing the process. And if you can reverse the process, it makes perfect sense. And you're just like, okay, we're on to something really, really great here. Now we can move forward and move that. So libido motivo, totally neutral. And maybe it's more the male fantasy about a certain libido or something like that. And then, of course, beneath that is the male fantasy about the female sexuality, which is, of course, volcanic. So just to clarify that. And by the way, you're perfectly welcome to kill everything I ever wrote and write a fantastic book and say, no, we women say it this way around. Like my girlfriend says, no, that's not the way we women look at it. And I go, how do you look at it? Which is exactly why I love dating her. Just a small comment on that one, though. When I date a woman and she tells me, because just like Adriana said, she thinks she has to be an event where she doesn't have to, because I can be the event and she can be the process. And I date her, go on a date, and she says, I don't feel you're really present with me right now. And I just look her in the eye and I say, darling, that's your job. I'm stuck in the past. I'm way much into the future. You are the present. That's exactly why I love your company. When I say that, I got nothing but a smile in return. Like, it makes perfect sense. So this is what I mean. The now that we, at least men, attribute to women is enormous. It's the entire fucking universe, as White would say, at any given momentum. That's how big the now is, that women own. For us men, that women own. So this is why you see how these things are symmetrical. Maybe it's masculine, maybe it's just my fantasy, but I've tried all these theories against women, against trans people, against LGBT people like I do here, and tried to be as shamano as I possibly can to try to come up with something that works as a platform we can work from.
I think just super shortly, Alexander, I think like the split of libido and mortido doesn't really work for women. It's like we have libidinal mortido and mortidinal libido. Like it's that thing, it does not explain how it works for women. But
but that's exactly the point. Here's the point.
Exactly.
Mortido is both mortido and libido.
Yeah.
And libido, because the denial of mortido cannot even be close to the mortido. So it's like you pushed the first thing that happens when you're born, and I've done rebirth things. I know what I mean here. The first thing that happens when you're born is that you had 9 months of fucking heaven inside the womb. And we all long back to that heaven. That's what any addict will admit. They long back to that heaven. We're forced to be born, and we're born, and the first reaction we get out is like, I want to die because I want to go back in. I don't want to exist as a separate unity separated from other. This is why there's another woman, an older woman, who drags you out, smiles at you, and says, welcome to life. We'll have a party. And you're just, what the fuck is this? And the whole process of doing that is, of course, to switch the mortido, which is the initial and the strong reaction, and it's always there, into a denial, which is libido. Libido is incredibly superficial. It's just like a little superficial thing dancing on top of the mortido. But for us men, it's the only possibility for us to stick with that, to not be woman. So not be pulled back into woman and be woman. I think the starting point for masculinity is that little tiny superficial fantasy lying there called the libido. So this is what we mean with libido when we use the word. It's a dialectics. It's always dialectics of libido, mortido everywhere.
I was going to add one thing, but maybe I can see the Madalena. Lovely to see Madalena. I was just going to compliment with Fanny, because I see in my work and Fanny's work, we're almost making too much of a polarity that actually doesn't exist. We're making it, Fanny's holding the polarity of libido. She's talking about eros more, and I'm talking about more mortido, as if they're completely separate, just to make a point that there are these 2 points. And for example, in the menstrual cycle, but in life, in a woman's trajectory, in the way she expresses. But when you said that libido is superficial, I would say, and then I hear also in Rachel's narrative when she talks about life, to me, it's like libido pervades everything. It's like the quality of mythos. So the quality of even logos from a woman's perspective, it's just that it's not sexual the way the man imagine it to be, but it is almost like a making love with life. It is like everything about life is sensual. So actually putting the chickens back in the coop and is there's beauty in it, but that's really hard because that's really hard to translate, because that's the diffuse light perspective on life and the laser beam.
I totally get it. And of course, the girl also has to deny she wants to go back into the womb as well. So the girl then has to go into the I'm next mother. So that next mother thing. So there's a denial of that too. And this is the power of libido. Maybe also we should allow ourselves after this conversation to use the terms eros and libido separately. So put libido in the context of libido mortido, a dialectical relation. Eros does not have a dialectics. I know people say eros and thanatos and all that, but if you're going to have a sort of modern vocabulary, maybe that could be a good idea. We can discuss that later. And at the end of the day, when anybody writes a book or publishes something, whatever, decides what words they're going to use, and then of course you try to explain those words with the glossary or whatever. So yeah, we back to Rachel first, and then we're going to go to the floor. So I want to have comments from Melody and everybody else out there. Certainly, you're welcome to join the conversation, but back to Rachel first.
Definitely excited to hear Madalena on this one too. Yeah, about the innocence and the eros, Adriana, like that's the thing. Like, okay, in the instance where like the guy holds the door open for me and I'm walking into the cafe, right, and I smile, it's like the energetic, the electromagnetic experience of that for me is like he's got this like warm, like shielding, but like providing space at the same time kind of vibe that if he's one with his masculinity, you know, that like gives me the space to move in. It's like this grounding freedom it's like grounding and it's liberating at the same time, and I can dance and move in it, right? And that's like, I had never heard about this, like not very often at least. Like I've heard about, you know, the dangers of men and how, you know, men mansplained and they're grown-up boys and all this stuff, right? But I never experienced that energy before. And I was like, this is amazing. Like I love masculinity because it has this like capacity to provide this space to be free in a whole new way. So like there's that eros and that dance and this like libido, like all these things are happening in those moments. And at some point, I don't think we're going to have time for it, but I really want to get into a discussion about like groups of women talking and how there's this sense of like eros that like produces to me like these harmonic clouds of mythos, like one after another, you know, depending on who's talking, everyone else kind of like mimetically reflects that like instantaneously and creates this intelligence that has this like libido all of its own too. Like it like starts to like move forward into something. And that's like a version of mythos, I think that is like supercharged, but we don't see it very much because it's only real time, really. It's not written down. It's not in like a fairy tale. It's like happening in the moment. And I like really want to, I don't know, understand that more.
Go on. I love this. Go on with the collective mythos. Want to hear more about it. Go on.
Okay, great. So these are like, you know, when I started getting invited to groups of women, I would like hang out, you know, around a picnic table at night, drinking wine or whatever. And like, there's just this, like, I call it a resonance field that sort of like builds. And like women are super good at like this like instant mimetic thing, right? So like a lot of times, like as like a warm-up practice, like one woman will like say something and then like 3 or 4 other women will like reflect that. They'll say that exact thing in a row, like boom, 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 boom. And it feels like it's like a warm-up. It's like building this resonance in this field together. And then like one woman tends to be like the leader of the harmony at a time, not the melody maker, but the harmony maker. And so she's kind of like the lead voice in the harmony. And then we all kind of like join in on our harmonic pitches with that and produce like a note together. And then like that might go on for a while. And then someone else becomes the lead harmonizer. And it has this like, it's this great, you know, like anything goes kind of vibe. And like, I feel like there is, I don't know if there's an archetype available for this or like what this is, you know. It feels like an archetype unto itself, like the weaving or like the matrix, you know, as a group or whatever. Like it just feels like it's such a potent event that it carries its own libido. And I'm still like, it just kind of like occurred to me to use these terms recently. So I'm still chewing on it. And I wanted to like pass this around a little bit.
It's a bit like the choir. The choir is always, you start with the sopranos and altos. And you put the inner circuit, again, first there, and then you complement it with the tenors and the basses around them.
Yeah.
And this is the fantasy, of course. The choir is the fantasy about the men being the outer circle, women in the inner circuit again. And this is why there's something magical about men looking at women. Okay, I'll give you an example here. mushroom trip, spiritual leaders, men and women together, Denmark, 10 years ago. Okay, what happened was that very soon, all the women sat in a group in the house. It's a huge room. It sat in a room and combed each other's hair. And we men were just lying around and looking at it up. Like our eyes were just like. And this is why, as a man, I get completely enthusiastic about this collective mythos idea. There is something like that going on in the room where the women are sitting in the room. This is what female spiritual work should do and should be obsessed with, because we men are just like, wow, when that happens.
Yeah, it has. Sorry. It has like a membrane that develops around it as well, right? Like guys will like approach that membrane and then they'll like get a whiff of it and they'll like turn around without saying a word sometimes. Like they just know this is not for you, this is not your space, but there's very much appreciation of it. Yeah.
As just a realization, and also speaking to you, Alexander, talk about how it's almost always completely inverted. And like with this thing, for men have to learn to kind of let go of their individuality to learn how to be collective, whereas women are like really trained to be collective. But for that magic to happen, women have to first be in their individuality, because if women just go in and don't have their individuality, like don't have their own eros, like are not in their own, then it just becomes this like this dead energy. But if you gather a group of women who like really are in their own, then this magical thing happens. And I think it's so cool that like, I think that's completely also inverted with how the masculine works.
It makes sense, because the dark side of that will be the lynch mob in the case of women. That's the dark feminine.
Exactly.
And with men, it's called rape and pillage.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that makes perfect sense too. Now we're going to let the floor in. Okay, all the rats sit down because the cat's going to enter the building. Madalena, the floor is yours. Have a go. You need to turn off your microphone. Turn on your microphone. There we go. Madalena, the floor is yours.
Well, I took the liberty of riffing off an IDW conversation on the right, the left, and taking one of your memorable statements saying it's just preservation of isolated silos. There's only conservatisms, and they're all deeply prejudiced and echoes of silos, period. And I've added, sexual politics is just stone cold dead in the water. All of it. Clans of mutual resentment. And if both sides are wrong, maybe we should live with the fact that both sides are wrong. Start from there. Fundamentalisms is culturally imposed, hierarchically stratified, mutual self-impotence, just pure mortito, the mumbling ghost of the death drive. No sense of humor, no self-irony. Okay, so that got me started into then delighting in your conversation on membranics, of course. But to contextualize, I'm going to work with Bonita here, I hope, and appeal to the fact that we are in a panarchy backloop reality. After August 6, 1945, which you don't stop reminding us, Bard, we hit the pure martito, okay? And after that, we've got this other event that affects this dialectic, which is the contraceptive pill, okay? Which really did determine the life of a woman before that was created. So beginning of cyborg, in other words. So I would love to see this membranics of affectability, affective intelligence in our time, where we really need a membranics that is a neutral method for both biology and technology based on relationalism, right? And we have one called placenta, the host body of a woman would kill the fetus if the placenta wasn't there. So it's not just a metaphysics. It's actually at the inception of our uterine being. And what does this membranics bring? A symbiotic antagonism. And this idea of harmonizing, equalizing, flattening difference. When we come from unity, we don't need to build unity. We come from unity. What we need is build the conditions of possibility for the fact that every single creature is its own sexual being. There are as many sexes as there are creatures. So I know this is ambitious, but I think that the experimentation in the felt sense, which is what I believe Benita is really leading us in what she talks about, and I hope she'll step in, because I know she's here, into practices of the felt sense. This is not a theoretical journey, even though theory may ooze out of it. But we need to experience this because this affects love. And love is, along with fear, disgust, resentment, the cocktail for authoritarianism, which is where we're headed if we don't experiment in this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madalena. Do anybody on the panel want to comment on that? It just stands on its own anyway.
I was just going to say that, Madalena, I mean, I'm going to get one thing, you said many things, but one thing when you talked about the contraceptive pill that in itself is controversial, but then it makes a woman literally not cyclical. Then we have like 30% or 25% of the population, I don't know how many women are on the pill at every given moment, then she is more linear in her psyche, like she's not ovulating and not actually menstruating. I mean, she bleeds, but she's not menstruating. So her psyche is doing something completely more, it's more close to what our concept of our psyche is when she's on the pill than actually what is available to us. So that also helps with the distortion that we have in culture, because we have in culture, let's say 50% or 45% of the population men, then we have the shamanoids, then we have amongst the women percentage, we have, let's say, I don't know what percentage we have of postmenopausal women, which are not cycling anymore. But if they had cycled, they would have cycled. If they had brought that into awareness, conscious awareness, they would be teaching their young women about the process that they are. But because we have been plonked into this culture, we don't teach this to our women. So then we feel relieved after we stop bleeding, because we're like, oh, finally we're more event-like, because we are as close as the men's psyche that we could be postmenopausal, never the same. But then we're not cycle. And then so then with the pill thing, we get this almost like it becomes more invisible. The problem gets more and more invisible for cycling women to see, because we have less mirrors. We have not much literature. A lot of postmenopausal women out in the world doing incredible work, but not talking about that, because that's not the point of their work, which is fair enough. It's not the point of everybody's work. But then it leads us to the confusion. So I was just going to add that, Madalena, because when you said about being in the body, I mean, there's nothing more in the body than the cycle. Actually, if you're living the flow, you are in the body, but it has become an abstraction for us. Modern people, it has become abstract, but it's birthing, dying. I
just wouldn't privilege that. I mean, there's so many things separating us from that natural state. Even just hearing birds. I mean, that. I wouldn't privilege that, because I think that'll happen in this playfulness, which I would just love to just name. Brashokereti. Did I say that right, Bard?
Brashokereti, yeah. No, this conversation is fantastic. It's its own theme. It reminds me of Donna Hathaway and the idea of a cyborg feminism versus a biofeminism. Personally, I would say both options look fantastic. I think this is an excellent future conversation as well. We can stay with it if you like. I'm thrilled with it because I think we both have to go cyborg and we both have to stay with biology. So I'm torn between these two positions. Don't fight the biology, which is archetypology, but embrace new technological possibilities, which is paradigmatics. And we are, for the first time, now going into biotechnology next. After we're done with the AI thing and that hype's over, biotechnology is going to be huge for the next 100 years. And we're going to go cyborgs. And I think Magdalena's right to that. The pill in the 1960s was a precursor as a milder form of cyborg among women, but huge because millions of women started taking the pill. My mother did not. So there you go. But what's happening now is that cyborg today is very much identified with the trans prefix. Maybe we could have a comment here from Aydan on this one or Rachel. But what do you think of the idea that actually one of the reasons why trans is so damn controversial, although it's so small for society as a whole, it's a privileged little thing that we shamanoids and LGBT people are obsessed with, the rest couldn't care less. But when it comes to that, the trans perspective here is because it's cyborgish. I give Aydan a little kickstart in that sense because when I do men's work, we separated the men's movement in Europe 3 years ago because the men who couldn't handle the trans men in the room were thrown out. And now the leading dominant version of men's work in Europe is totally embracing with trans men. And the attitude is very simple. A trans man is a man who made an effort to become a man. We're all making an effort to become a man. We could not have a more manly man in the room than a trans man. Discussion over, which is a great place to start from doing men's work. So let's see if Aydan has a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely a pushback because there's a sense that people have, I think, and it often seems to come from people who are concerned with the environment, like environmentalists, kind of more like almost liberally minded people. I think sometimes like will push back on the idea of trans identities because there's a sense that like, and we Adriana and Rachel and I discussed this a lot, the idea that there's this separate thing going on of cycle dysphoria, which needs to be distinguished from gender dysphoria. And that this distinction can really do a lot to be able to help people to have like a sense of like, if I am oriented in a way that doesn't feel quite right to me, like, is that something that is coming from culture into me, into my body, or is it coming from my body out into culture? And I feel like that's what like gender dysphoria has something to do with like, well, culture is pointing back to me something that doesn't make any sense. Sorry. Alexander, you're muted.
Sorry. We have people in the room who haven't turned off the microphone, although they're not talking. If you're not talking, please turn off your microphone. We expect you to actually be able to be adult enough to handle that. So we just got the guy who got tons of people talking. So Aydan, I don't want you to be disturbed. That's why I broke it. There you go.
Okay.
Yes.
That's okay. So yeah, I think that there's a kind of like a directionality that I think can help in this view where am I avoiding my cycle by transitioning, or am I moving towards something that makes much more sense as a way for me to become a part of society, because that's the other part of it is there's a sense that people have that like when people are transitioning that like, and to some extent this is true just by the way that things are right now, but that like by transitioning that you are isolating yourself, that you're pulling yourself away from life and from society in some way. And yeah, I think that the threat, the overwhelming pressure that people feel from the access to technologies to be able to affect bodies in this way is definitely feeding into how intense the conversation is, guys, just kind of like grown and grown and grown in some circles, as far as kind of like you'll hear a lot of doom and gloom about the idea that, oh, well, trans people are pointing towards like the downfall of civilization, not like like I hear it regularly, like in certain.
I tell you what, all I need to do in man's work is to get a trans man to walk into the room and talk about himself as a biohacker, problem solved. And all the guys get totally enthusiastic because they realize just biohacking. That's what it is. It's just simple. But I think the cyborg thing here is an important aspect of it. I know both Bonita and Ken have lined up, and I really want to talk. I suspect that Bonita has a comment on what we just talked about. So if you don't mind, Ken, I'm going to let Bonita in first, and then I'm going to pass over to Ken. There you go, Bonita.
Yeah. So I want to just, Adriana was like, we're all the post-menopausal women. And this is probably the only kind of conference that I would have been able to share this story. And then I want to ask your comments on my own experience. So in around 2006, 7, 8, 2006 and 7, and I hadn't been taking the pill for 20 years. So I had normal cycles. And, if you know me, I'm quite integration of feminine qualities, masculine kind of, I'm kind of mixed, I'm kind of more of a, I would say, an integration. So anyways, I didn't have endometriosis and I didn't have cancer, but what was happening was I had like portions of my uterus were making other uteruses. So basically I was menstruating all the time. And my hematocrit was so low that when I went in for a Lyme's disease test, they said, you have to come in for a blood transfusion or you're going to die. But because it had happened over a long period of time, I wasn't in jeopardy of dying, but I was cold all the time, right? So this was very interesting. I tried to, they said, well, you might be anyways. So I thought about it for a while, but there's a couple of things that go with this. And it's all about like hormones changing really rapidly, which a lot of you, the trans people have these great experiences with. And that is, okay, so one of the reasons why I didn't do anything about it right away was that I felt euphoric all the time. I mean, it's basically bloodletting, right? And it's just like, so I was just this was when I started writing first, all my spiritual stuff or integral, all this kind of like amazing things were happening. And I look back at it now, and I know it's because it was like bloodletting, and women who go through the cycle understand this thing. So, but it was getting ridiculous. Like I had to take 3 pairs of pants to work. Nothing could, it was just getting ridiculous. And I was cold all the time. And even though the doctor said it's not life-threatening, it really wasn't. I was so anemic. So I had a radical hysterectomy. Everything was taken out, right? The ovaries, the cervix, and the uterus. And I healed very quickly. I remember thinking 3 days after my surgery, I felt better than I had in a long time, just in terms of like vitality. But then the craziness started to happen, right? And this was very interesting to me because I didn't go on hormone replacement therapy. I just wanted to watch. But what happened, I don't think I've ever read a correct account of what testosterone does, what estrogen does, that could have predicted what happened to me. It seemed the exact opposite, okay? So a lot of times, so just prior to this period, I had a lot of tolerance for risk. I was running 100-mile endurance races with horses. I bought the farm. I got a stallion. I asked for this huge wage at the job. We were building the farm, all this stuff. And when I got my hysterectomy, I became a nervous wreck. And people would describe women as the opposite. Men are big risk takers. Women don't take risks. But it was like, this is exactly how it felt. It was like my whole life, I had a lot of yang energy, and to maintain it, I needed a huge pool of water. And all of a sudden, the water was gone. And I got agoraphobic. I would drive down the road. I couldn't find myself in space and time. I remember having a retreat, and I sat there in bed, and I woke up, and it was going to rain all weekend. And I started to panic, and I thought, who the fuck's this body? Because I wasn't the type of person that panicked. And I would cry all the time. I was so, what I would call what normally they would say the feminine thing, you know? So I think it's really dangerous to ascribe certain things. I mean, I think all people's experiences are different when your hormones are changing drastically. And so I think we can only be true to our own experiences. And so this is where I find talking about the hormones and the archetypal male and female, I think it's not neatly separated. So I don't know. I think you guys probably have a lot more information to like feedback to me than. I'm fine now. I'm older and not having hormones is a problem. Like your hair goes to shit and certain things, your skin goes to shit. But in general, I found I'm probably more balanced psychologically, or I feel more balanced psychologically than I did even just prior to that. Yeah. So I appreciate your comments.
I think a lot of the work we're doing, especially speaking on behalf of me and Fanny here in Scandinavia, is that we live in a culture where men and women are together constantly all the time. And we realize that this is an over-sexualized space that makes them go completely exhausted. And this is why all the spiritual traditions, definitely in Eastern spirituality, have always separated men and women to work with them separately. Because when you work spiritual people, you stay with one sex and you stay with one gender if you prefer to, and that's how you succeed. And then they're united as a community afterwards. I'll give an example of that. I drank ayahuasca for many years in Peru. In Peru, it's always a communal experience. It's the entire tribe. It's men and women, different ages. Anybody who's a grown-up is allowed to participate in the ceremony. And then I discovered in Europe, when ayahuasca started taking off 20 years ago, there was a huge need for women to drink ayahuasca without men in the room. And then I realized and started experimenting with having ceremonies with only men in the room and no women. And it worked wonderfully. And then I realized, okay, Peru, men and women are separated most of the time. So to have a communal experience is what they need when they go spiritual. In our culture, spirituality has been restarted today. You know me, Bonnie, you and I have this conversation about Eastern spirituality, how it needs to be imported, the way we export our technologies to the East. We need to import their spirituality. I think fundamentally, this is about doing men's work and women's work. And then, of course, the first question is, in what way are men and women different? And then we start playing around with archetypes. We're not fixed with them. And every exception to any rule we have is interesting precisely because it is the exception. So which allows the maximum amount of freedom allowed. But for me, doing men's work today, like I said before to the girls, I said, listen, the women are way ahead of men in changing religion. They switched already. I mean, the Buddha statues, the candlelights, everything you see everywhere, the demands of Buddhism and Hinduism and what women are doing. Fanny might think they don't have the eros in it yet. Wait a second. You're like 30 years ahead, 40 years ahead of men anyway in switching religion. We need to do the same thing for men. This is my work, what I'm doing. And this is why I'm interested in sex and gender as typologies and see what we can get out of it, because I need it. Because the men come up to me, young men come up to me and ask all the time, who am I? What should I do? And you have to have a good answer to that question. That's what we do in this research. So Ken, finally, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And thanks all of you. This is a wonderful, wonderful session. What I have seen, and it is a wonderful microcosm of the whole conference, especially the comment that to change sex, first you take out the old hormones, then you put in the new ones. So what I've seen here over and over and over is a group of people who are willing to tear the overlay of the clockwork universe paradigm off of life and look at what is actually happening. And this is very important because we are in a time when the clockwork universe is killing us. And if we do not find a better way of thinking about the world, this wonderful civilization that we have in many, many ways is over. So we are at the vanguard. And the one thing I really wanted to emphasize was one part of the clockwork universe is that nothing is real unless it is in a category that defines it. I am a man. I know how to act. For all those people who sense, and I think it's an enormous number of people, sense that something is really, really, really wrong, but don't have the tools and haven't developed to the point where they can tear off the clockwork universe. The answer is fear and terror. And that's the real battle, I think, as Madalena was pointing out. That's the real battle. I contrary to everything I see, I have this optimism that I can't even explain to myself. But what is happening in this group is a microcosm of what is happening in the world. And I want to tell you how wonderful it is to be with 100 other people who think that the world is more like a process than a product. So that's all I wanted to say.
And you're so sweet. Love you to bits, brother. Yeah, we're going to go into the closing round. That was great words to finish off the main conversation, I think. So basically the framing of what you just said, I think, is that the devil is here because the devil has been with us since August the 6th, 1945. I mean, obviously, that's why Oppenheimer was last year's big movie. We're going back to that story again, finally. And we're dealing with it. We're trying to find the divine. And the divine is certainly both masculine and feminine in equal parts. That's where we have to go. And this is why I'm saying it's not about going from event to process, dialectical move. It's about including the process in the event. Because if you talk in Asia with Indians and Japanese and Chinese people, they will say they're tired of the process. In India, they're so sick of the caste system and the process that they got stuck with because they're missing the event. So if we can export the event to the East from the West, then certainly we can start importing the process from the East to the West to finally arrive at a process and event, which actually with the genders is man and woman. So this is repeated. We cannot go on without the shared leadership. There must be shared leadership, a shared management of the world between men and women. Absolutely. There's no way we can do it. And this is why when I talk to men, I preach to men and say that it was women who brought ecology onto the table. And ecology is the next devil. So instead of having a God saving us from the devil because we're not controlling the bomb, we got another devil here now. This is the slowly, gradually moving devil that takes over the world right now, but it's already affecting us in every way possible. We call it climate change. And that's why ecology, of course, ecology is the perfect name for process in our culture as well. And we have then ecological, we have religion around ecology, and we have religion around Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism. We're importing from these as well. And what they're standing up against, which is what Bonita and John and I discussed yesterday, is John so brightly said was that there's not just the fundamentalisms coming out of Christianity and Islam that have gone more and more desperate. The other fundamentalism coming now is the one coming out of big tech. It comes out of Silicon Valley. It's the pillar saints and the boy pharaohs of technology who walk in through the door and think just because they're computer scientists, they know how to run the world. And they're computer scientists, and they have billions of dollars in the bank account, and they want to be philosophers, they want to be artists, and they're not. And therefore, we have this other form of fundamentalism, which John perfectly described yesterday as scientific fundamentalism or scientistic fundamentalism. This idea that science can respond to absolutely everything, and therefore scientific fundamentalism is next around the door. And the scientific fundamentalism will bring a surveillance police state with it. It's already happening in communist China. We do not want it to happen in America or Australia or Europe or anywhere else. And this is again, the masculine logos pathos without the mythos. It doesn't have a story to tell us. It doesn't tell us a story about what it means to be human. Like Dr. Shushkov said, the human has been removed for technology to play its card without human being involved. This is just the next fundamentalism we have to deal with. All these little boy fundamentalisms we're dealing with all the time that have to be torn down. Had to be torn down and replaced by a process and event. And the great thing about process and event being unified and both playing a dialectical part is that it's impossible to be fundamentalist when you have process and event at the same time. It's impossible. It's impossible to be fundamentalist, which exactly the sort of anti-dogmatic stance we must take today. Hope that makes sense. So I want to have a closing round. I want to start with Fanny first and be free to play in. We have a few more minutes to go. So Fanny, where are you at?
Getting late here, a bit tired, but this has been brilliant. Yeah, I mean, I think you summarized it well, that it's almost like we need women who embrace the event and we need men who embrace the process. And to me, like women who embrace the event, like it really starts in embracing our sexuality and eros. And it's exactly like in Tantra, like men need to hold in their energy and be able to hold, and women need to become alive, become awakened. And that's what we need, alive women who embrace the event, who embrace the erotic in themselves, and men who can stand and hold and serve process. Yeah, just maybe a short comment, just Benita, to what you were sharing. Like, to me, it makes perfect sense, and to me, it's like the inverted experience, and because it talks to what I just shared, that like I was very disconnected from my body and my sexual center, and I was more that nervous wreck. And then when I got connected to my sexual center, that I became less of that nervous wreck. So like the inverted, what you're talking about, and exactly what you're saying, that you're calling like that nervous wreck is the feminine. Like, to me, that's not the feminine. That's the feminine without mistos, eros, and nomos. And that's the point. And what we see as the feminine is a distorted, suppressed version of the feminine. And to me, it makes perfect sense that you remove the bodily parts that are a source, has been a source for that all your life, and then you remove it and you have to find a new way of finding it. So to me, that experience makes perfect sense. Unless, of course, we have this distorted idea of what the feminine is. I think that's a good closing story of sharing that. And then, just so grateful to you, Rachel and Aydan. And like, I'm curious even more to look into like what is the role of, I love what you said, like how can we serve the straights or something like that. Like, I think you have such an important role to play. It's like, I want to go even deeper into that. Like, what is the role of the trans and the shamanoids for the 92%? We're so messed up. Like, we need you. Maybe that's the last wording. But thank you for this.
Rachel, the floor is yours.
Oh my gosh, I'm so gratified. This has been amazing. Like much more of this, please. My fascination just like grows incrementally with every time someone talks. What Benita was saying about her experience, like all this shit like fascinates me, because like we're still looking for other like well-adjusted trans people to talk to. Like, it's really hard. I don't know. The communities that I'm in, the kind of the culture, it's hard to really have open conversations like this, to talk about the specifics of what the hormones are doing and not doing, and like what your experience is, to gather more information, to kind of like see where the scatter plot goes, which is totally exciting. Like, I just want to, and like Bard, hopefully you have some more data on this kind of thing, but like what sort of generalities happen with people, because it's not, like my experience was so astounding to me on hormones, and all the variations that were happening. But the only thing that made sense of them was actually like Bard's work in the IDW, and you guys, like, I was like, oh, this all fits into this, pattern in a lot of ways. So like any outliers are super interesting to me, and all of the like the stuff that Aydan and I talk about in our kind of opposite directions. Like, we have our own patterns, but then like another trans guy might have a totally different experience than Aydan did. But we're trying to figure out like how much of that is signal and noise and all that stuff. It's fascinating.
I think maybe there's something on to there with trans shamanoid, because you're probably both, in the sense that there's a lot of trans people who are just trans people. They want to be trans men, trans women, and they're perfectly happy with it. But if you're both trans and shamano, like if you're LGBT, like if you're a gay shaman, for example, in men's work, the gay shaman is incredibly important. Oh God, it's important. The gay shamans I work with in men's work, when they deal with men's mother wound, it's magic. It's just magic. It just takes an imagination that other people don't have. And it comes from the gay experience with the shamanoid personality. And maybe the shamanoid is even more stronger with you and Aydan than trans. And that's exactly why you're ahead of the curve and understand and can phrase more what the trans experience is like. Others will follow, for sure. Others will follow. Absolutely. So Adriana, where is she? Deleuze's daughter.
Oh my goodness, it's been super rich. Hopefully, the beginning of many conversations. I love what you shared, Bonnie. I probably won't have time to go into the nuances of that, but it makes total sense. Like, to me, you are a female philosopher. Like, you show the diffuse awareness of the feminine so brilliantly, and you are the joint capacity of logos from mythos. To me, you model that beautifully, and in a construct in which the cycles have been so suppressed and we just have these contracted versions of ourselves, the fact that removing the womb would mess with your awareness and everything. But then now you have this clarity because, of course, you're not cycling the hormone, so you can embody it and be it and model it. And I do think that in this point in history that we are so confused, we need all of us to make sense, because it's much more fine-grained than what we make seem. But at the same time, we need to separate the female type of awareness and the male type of awareness to just start the conversation, and then we can fine grain and nuance and have the trans shamans. And one thing that I was going to say about Rachel and Aydan, I see them as transitioning, adulting, like after their transition, they've been maturing into a more whole adult, which is not why a lot of people transition. So then we have to nuance that as well. Like the concept of wanting to transition as a teenager and escaping the mess of being teenager, and as opposed to something else. That's what they're doing. So there's so much in this, and I love your frames, Bud, and Fanny. It's been amazing working with you. So yeah, thank you. Much more of this, please. And
I'm going to quote Fanny Norlin here, because when I'm working with archetypology, I always says that I work with archetypology for men because I'm a man. I can't imagine what it's like for women. You girls, you invent that. And then Fanny just goes back and said, oh, I get it. You guys doing horizontal archetypology, the different types of men and what kind of man you're going to be. Our archetypology is fundamentally vertical. And Fanny says, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. You just described it beautifully by giving Juanita a role she already owns, which is the female philosopher, which is the matriarch. And the matriarch is woman past reproduction cycle. And the power the woman who's past the reproduction cycle has over both men and women is intense. This is the power of the Supreme Court. This is the power of the woman who says, you guys come in here, I hold you responsible for what you promised. If you haven't promised, if you haven't delivered on your promises, fuck you, off you go, you're not going to fuck my daughters. That's the power of the matriarch. And I really look forward to that too. I'm looking forward to see what Bonita's going to do eventually, because it's going to be absolutely awesome to see her as a real matriarch and a female philosopher develop it. And this is all because of what Fanny fooled me into believing. So it's all Fanny's fault that I said this. Here we go. So Aydan, where are you?
I'm right here. Yeah, I think like this definitely brings to mind something I had mentioned in an email exchange. I think like between just those of us who are going to be moderating and being a part of this conversation. But you know, a lot of this comes back to this idea of gender fascism to me, which I would describe as having different flavors. So like there's a kind of attitude of sex is just biology and should just stay biology. There's that kind of gender fascism, that gender doesn't exist, and any expressions of gender are something that we're just kind of confusing for some other kind of identity expression. And there's also the obvious, like traditional sex is everything. So like the fundamentalists. So that's more how I grew up. I grew up in a Mormon household, and that was really kind of how they saw things. And then there's like the gender fundamentalism that's kind of like, well, gender is everything and nothing about my body or anything like that has anything to do with my gender. And yeah, the truth is that it's just like so much more complex than that. And that we're all kind of like we're in a situation right now where, I think it's definitely risky as far as, looking at earlier and earlier transitions. But that I think like we need to make more room for the idea of like a trans person being their own thing, just like Bart is saying, like and to me that ends up allowing for trans people to imagine themselves as trans people instead of always trying to be something that they're never going to be able to be. And I think that a lot of like the dissatisfaction that ends up coming out of transition has something to do with that. And yeah, there's so much richness in the conversation that can come out of just like focusing on the feminine. I think I was glad to see that like most of this ended up coming back to female archetypes and the idea of like the feminine in culture and how like that has been set aside kind of like out of some kind of sense of convenience. And that's really, again, this is like the gender fascism thing. Like we're always trying to seek the convenient answer of reductionism. And I think that more than anything, to keep the conversation open and wide open is going to benefit everyone. The cat's out of the bag. Like the technology's here. It's here. We can't put it back. We can't erase it. We can't pretend it's not there. So yeah, the more research, the more information, like we should be doing better gathering of information of these experiences. We should be doing like they're closing off clinics that are treating trans people for good reason, I think, because they're not doing the job of tracking what's happening to people when they're going on these treatments. And that's not correct. That is not going to serve anybody, anytime, anywhere. So that's the biggest thing that needs to happen is we need to shift towards a flowering of the conversation and a blossoming of the conversation towards more exploration instead of like retreating back into silos where we're just going to defend our position from kind of a fascist point of view.
I agree completely. And this is why even in progressive Sweden, where Fanny and I live, it's less than 10 years when we fought for the right to be she-male. It's just like, again, the boundary from this to that. It's just like, no, trans man, trans woman can be anything in between. You know, we have imagination. We can invent anything we like in between and find you around at that point. And then you come around to the other really healthy dialectical reaction right now, which is gays and lesbians. I got to say, what is wrong with being gay or lesbian? I don't have to change my sex at all. I'm perfectly happy being man or woman. I'm just happy to be gay. You know, all those dialectical reactions are part of the conversation. They're healthy. But I think we've come on to something really profound here tonight that I really buy into, and that is the journey with the trans journey is only just begun, but it is universal in the sense that we're all moving towards cyborgism. And we are, because sex moves very, very, very slowly, but it moves. It's also a process, but it's one of these eons of time before the process you could see the pattern, whereas gender can move very, very quickly and can be playful and jump back and forth. And this is why I think people take so strongly to the idea of surgery and hormones and these things, because it is the beginning of a cyborgism. And I think if trans people can own the fact you're the pioneers of cyborgism,
right,
then you're speaking universally. You're no longer particulars. And then you can talk to us as men and women out here who try to just find new places for being men and being women within a community for us together. I think it's wonderful. All right, guys, we're over time. Wonderful conversation. Love the UTOK this year. This has just been absolutely flawless and perfect. And let's keep the conversation going. Absolutely, we only just begun. So good night from Stockholm.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Night.
Big love.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alexander. Love you.